Bonjour Alysia Abbott. Votre père a écrit que le parent est l'écrivain de l'enfant. Comment vous a-t-il transmis cette passion des mots et de l'écriture?
From a very early age, he made sure to involve me in his life as a writer. He wasn't the sort of parent who was at great pains to separate his work life from his personal life, in part because he didn't have the privilege of having a partner to share raising me. And so often he would take me with him to poetry readings, to bookstores, to, you know, even literary festivals like the Marathon des Mots. And so by doing so, I think he felt that this would be a good education for me. And he also encouraged me to um, when I learned a poem in school, he had me read it on stage at one of these poetry events. He also would quote me in his writing, and encouraged me to draw and write. So, it was definitely sort of a family occupation.
Votre père se décrivait comme un poète dans le San Francisco de 1976, où cela signifiait encore quelque chose d'être poète. En quoi cette ville était-elle justement si poétique?
Well, San Francisco in the 1970s was a place of great creative exploration. The city was still very inexpensive, and a lot of artists were drawn to the idea of sexual and creative liberty that was really unique to San Francisco at that time. And so, there was a sort of respect, I think, for poets, a curiosity, a romanticism about the life of a artist, the life of a poet that would not have existed in Nebraska, where my father was from, for example. And so there was, a growing community, many spaces where you could meet other writers and perform poetry. But this was a really fertile ground for my father to explore and develop this career, and this passion.
Dans votre livre Fairyland aux éditions Globe, vous nous invitez dans le San Francisco des années 70. En quoi était-ce un monde enchanté, un royaume, un Fairyland pour l'enfant que vous étiez et la communauté gay de l'époque?
So I chose the title Fairyland because of the double meaning that the word evokes. There is an idea that as I was writing the book, or right before I wrote the book, I was studying children's literature. I was taking classes at Harvard and reading about the world of Peter and Wendy, Peter Pan, and this idea of the Neverland, and the Neverland being a place where there is no bedtimes, and time itself is circular. You don't grow up, and there's a sense of endless play, and an escape from the demands of society, um, and the demands of mothers and parents. And so, in some ways, is what San Francisco was. It was a place where if you didn't want to get married, you didn't want to follow, the expectations of your parents, and follow a sort of traditional career. San Francisco had a place for you, and that for a lot of men, I think, especially at the time, this was decades before gay marriage would be legal, and the idea of it was completely unimagined. So that if you were choosing to be open and gay, it meant in some ways you were renouncing, the social conventions and expectations of marriage and conservative values, and tradition, and so that men could men and women could in some ways come to a place like San Francisco and never have to grow up. They could still play, whether that was a matter of playing through the arts or playing um, through exploration of sexuality. And then for me, it was a Neverland and a fairyland because it was a time I was living there when my imagination was so rich. And my father cultivated this through costume that we would dress up and through games of pretend. And now when I look back on that time, it also feels like a fairyland because that San Francisco, for many reasons, no longer exists. And so it feels like a foreign land, like something in a fairy tale book.
Dans ce conte de fées, il y avait un cauchemar nommé Sida. Certains le comparent à cette ère de Covid. Qu'en pensez-vous?
How was this last year compared to the AIDS years? Well, I think it was very triggering for me and other people who lived through AIDS, in part because in the beginning of the COVID epidemic, there was so little understood about the transmission of COVID, and there was a sense of generalized fear. I still remember when we would, spray our mail with bleach. We were afraid to go shopping. And this sense of who's clean and who's not, who's safe, who can you get close to, that, felt on a level reminding me of the fear that I felt when when I was scared of my father getting sick, but then even after he was sick with AIDS and I was living with him, what could I eat off of his plate or, handle his dishes or, things in the bathroom. So, yet there are, and similarly too, there was a sense in the United States anyway of a communities being scapegoated. So in the AIDS era, for a long time, there was a sense of, well, AIDS is a problem for the gay community. It's a problem for drug users. It's a problem for, Haitians. It's not a problem for like the real Americans, or the broad mainstream American experience. But of course, it was, and it spread and became such. With COVID in the early days and on through under the Trump presidency, there was a scapegoating of the Chinese community and the larger Asian American Pacific Islander community. And so, that was deeply distressing. Yet there are really significant differences, like the fact that we have a COVID vaccine so quickly here, that we were able to mobilize the sciences and and produce tests and produce vaccines so quickly and making it so readily available when AIDS went for many decades, for many years, the urgency of finding a cure was delayed. The science was not invested in because I believe, there was a neglect because there was a sense that this was something that was a problem for the gay community.
Ce livre est aussi une belle histoire d'amour entre un père et sa fille. Quel est le plus beau cadeau qu'il vous ait donné?
Well, the gift that my father gave me was that I believe he saw me as a writer and an artist before I saw myself as that. Like in some ways, I feel like parents can see a potential in their children, and they can cultivate that potential, by shining sunlight and feeding, the seeds with water. And I feel that my father did this for me. He would talk about me as though I were already a writer. As in letters to me, his books were coming out, or they're being published, and he said, "I hope one day, you get to experience having your books being published." Or he would comment on my letters saying, "I really like how your use of detail in this letter. It's really important to use, all five senses when you're writing." And his encouragement of me, it felt like when I did finally publish my book and I did have the experience of, engaging in conversations around the ideas in my book, that I felt like his dream was coming to fruition. And it was almost like I could see, the I could be in conversation with him. Like, furthermore, he put me into this French school when I was in first grade, and also with an idea that that French culture is important, and to know another language is important, and he wanted me to take part in an intellectual life that he wanted to be part of. And so he was making this investment in an idea of a future that he didn't get to live to see, but that I continued to benefit from thanks to him.